Welcome to Dr. Mann's teaching series, How to Live a Balanced Life. Dr. Mann is the host of both the television program Real Life and the radio show Real Life Radio. He is also the senior pastor of Riverbend Church in Austin, Texas. And now, Part 5, Let God Tell You Who You Are.
I'm going to speak today from the life of the Old Testament king Saul. You can read about him in 1 Samuel 9 through 31. Would you like for me to read 22 chapters, or can I summarize it? Would that be all right? Oh, you want me to read it? Okay. Saul is a tragic story, but a very interesting story that we can identify with. Israel was moving out of the Dark Ages. She was being harassed by the Philistines, who had developed iron weapons, and the Israelites only had bronze weapons, and they needed a leader. And so they decided to have a king, and the last of the prophets and judges, Samuel, goes to a village and finds a young man named Saul. It says he's a foot taller than anybody else in Israel, and he's quite more handsome than anybody else. Young man, gifted, beautiful, man after God's own heart. So he anoints him king, and immediately Saul has some remarkable victories. But on about his third victory, Samuel does not want to retire, evidently, so he comes and criticizes him openly, and many of the generals join Samuel in the criticism. That triggers a descent into madness for Saul. You know the story. He was rebuked, made fun of, then he got desperate and started consulting witches and mediums, and that only increased his downfall. And finally, he is murdered in battle, falls on his own sword, actually. And his body and the body of his son Jonathan are hung at the place called Beit Shan. And David takes his army and goes and rescues the king. You can read about it. I won't read it to you today. But it's a classic example of how we deteriorate and lose our inner self. Every time I lead a group to Israel, those of you who've been know that our first stop after we arrive and sleep one night is to a very unusual place. In fact, the guides are amazed every year that I choose this place to stop. We go across the Sea of Galilee over to the east side, which was one time Jordan. It was called Gadara in Jesus' time, and there was, as you make your way around the Sea of Galilee, there are some hills, some cliffs with tombs. And as you know, there was a man there who was psychotic and probably multiple personality disorder is what we would call it today. But they said he was possessed of demons. And he would cut himself day and night and shriek and terrorize everybody who passed that way. And you remember that Jesus walked up to him and asked him a simple question. He asked him, he said, "What is your name?" And you remember what he said? He said, "I have so many names. My name is Legion. I have so many voices within that I really don't know who I am. I don't have a name because of all of these inner voices." And I ask the people, I say, on this 10-day trip, I want you to see if you can answer the question, who tells you who you are? The most important question you'll ever ask yourself in life, doesn't matter if you're a child or an adult or how long you've been here, is who tells me who I am? Because we have all these voices that are put inside us, even when we're growing up, before we know it. We may be unaware of them, but there's something inside you, many voices, that are always competing with the true you to ask you the question, who are you? And if you want to see a study of how to lose your sense of self-worth, your sense of being who you are or what you are, if you want to see a great symbol of how to lose that, study the life of King Saul. He started out handsome, smart, beautiful, able, and he slowly descends into absolute madness because of who he let inside tell him who he was. That is your burden. Jesus was so miraculous with people because he always sailed around and found who they really were. Not who they thought they were, but who they really were. And in many ways, to be saved simply means to be restored to yourself. It says after Jesus touched him and drove the demons out of him, they went into the pigs and went into the ocean. It said the man was himself again. When he told the story of the prodigal son, what happened when he was in the hog pen? Do you remember? After he'd wasted his life, the prodigal son. He came to himself. He rediscovered who he was. How do we combat these voices within? Well, let's look at Saul. He's a negative example, but a good one nonetheless. First thing he did wrong was let his critics tell him who he was. Started out fine, won some battles. He was everybody's hero, and then he waited too long to go into battle as Samuel had told him. And Samuel gets him in front of all of the men and berates him, criticizes him, calls him down. And immediately all the soldiers, the leaders, start criticizing him, making fun of him. And that's the beginning of his descent. He began to let his critics tell him who he was. I heard an interview with George Burns one time, one of my favorites. And they asked him, how did he handle all the critics through the years when he was a professional actor and entertainer? He said, always be kind to your critics. They're using the only talent they have. Critics. Who tells you who you are? When I went into the ministry and got into trouble right away, which is almost synonymous with going into the ministry, because I dared to try to think for myself and ask questions nobody else would ask, and I didn't want to talk like a preacher, act like a preacher. And I went to see Carlisle Marney, who turned out to be a great gift in my life and was the mentor for so many pastors in my generation. I went to see Marney, and he had this big, deep voice, and Marney liked to talk in mysterious ways and give you an answer that would make you think. And I said, how do I live with criticism? He said, oh, that's simple. Learn to say, I. I said, what does that mean? He said, if you can't figure that out, you can't be a minister. Learn to say, I. Learn what he meant now, I understand. Learn where your boundaries leave off and your critics' boundaries start. Don't let other people tell you who you are with your criticism. Some of the most destructive things we do is in response to criticism. I think the real good news of Jesus Christ is that he came to show us that we didn't have to listen to the critics. Don't let your critics tell you who you are. I was thinking the other day of how many young people are deprived of great careers because they do something wrong or they make a mistake, they get laughed at, they get criticized, and they never try again. Who tells you who you are? Many of us grow up with these critics' voices in our heads. And the secret of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that God thinks you are somebody. And listen to what he has to say. So, one easy way to lose yourself, let your critics tell you who you are. Second mistake that Saul made was he let his cants, C-A-N', he let his cants tell him who he was. There was no way that any king could lead the Israelite army to victory against the Philistines. The Philistines had developed iron weapons. They were fighting with bronze weapons. It'd be like sticks and stones. And there is no way that anybody could have defeated the Philistines. But here was Saul winning 2 or 3 remarkable battles. And every time he won a battle, it was really a miracle. There was no way he should have won the battle. But slowly but surely, he began to realize he could not win all of the battles. And then he began to retreat. There are many people walking around today who quit because they were told they can't and they discovered they couldn't. I've never told this story to anybody, maybe Carlton Dillard, which I'm sure he forgot quickly. And you will know, not because he's forgetful. But I was actually quite a singer at one time. It's true. I was in the Houston Boys Choir. You had to go and audition for it. And I was in there. And is it correct to call the boys' choir the guy with a high voice a soprano? If it's a children's choir, not if it's... sopranos are usually women, right? Okay. But I wasn't a baritone and I wasn't a tenor. I was a soprano and I had this beautiful voice. And then one day, when I began to have pimples, my voice kept going up here, down here, up here, down, in the same sentence. My voice changed. Well, I wanted to pursue my singing, so Mother got me this guy who was the best voice lesson teacher in Houston. And I worked with him 2 days a week for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to go to Juilliard School of Music. I want to be a singer. He said, well, let me tell you something. He said, let me tell you something. You're the hardworkingest kid I've ever had. And I've never seen anybody work and discipline themselves. And you try so hard, and you try, and you try, and you try. And I want you to know you are 5 times better singer now than when you came to see me 6 months ago. There's only one problem. You can't sing. I said, well, you said I did 500 times better. He said 5 times 0 is 0. So I was down for a while. He said, go find something you can do good. And I said, well, you have any ideas? He said, well, you're good at spinning yarns. He said, you'd probably make a good preacher. Well, did God have him plant that seed? I don't know, but I can tell you this. Had I spent the rest of my life listening to my can'ts instead of my cans, I don't know where I would be today. Probably with an address in Huntsville. Yeah, how many of us have lived our lives by what we can't do? Almost every week I hear somebody who says, back in 1937 or 8 or 68 or 88, I was turned away, I was rejected, and it just scarred my entire life. Nothing has ever worked for me since. You know, William Raspberry, the African-American writer for the Washington Post, I think is a very good writer. And years ago I read an article. He did a study asking the question, why do newly arrived Asian immigrants move into the ghettos, which are predominantly African-American, which are steeped in poverty and crime? How do they come from Asia and move in and prosper? What makes them prosper when the people they live around don't prosper? Now, I don't think that would be a proper question for somebody who is Anglo, but Raspberry studied that, and maybe you read it. But he said it's the difference in how you look at things. An Asian arrives in America and sees it as a big candy store with a plate glass window and bars up. And he peers through the window and through the bars and he says, let me in there. And as soon as the door opens, he's in there. But Raspberry said too many of the African American, his comrades, look in the candy store and all they see are the bars on the windows. And they say, I cannot get in. I can't get in because I've been deprived. And he ends up saying, this is going to sound awfully smarmy, but if you think you can't, you can't. And that's true with all of us, whether we've been discriminated against because of our heritage or whatever. If you think you can't, you can't. Saul descended into madness. He lost his self, the self God had created, first by listening to his critics and letting them tell him who he was, and then secondly, by letting his can'ts tell him who he was. And finally, and this marked the real downfall, he let his competitors tell him who he was. His competitor, of course, was young David. As David's popularity and celebrity and achievements began to rise to the top, Saul descends into complete paranoia because he couldn't be what David was. And I don't know how many of us walk around in life letting our competition tell us who we are. Preachers are the very worst. I went to a meeting not long ago and with about 12 pastors, and we sat down. We had an afternoon deal. We had prayer. We ate dinner. We were sitting around. And we started talking about our churches. And preachers are just like everybody else. You can't be around them a half a day without them telling you how many they had in church and how many conversions, et cetera, et cetera. So I was determined I was not going to say how many. I was just not going to do that. I was the oldest guy there. So I get there and I sit there and somebody says, first crack out of the box. How many members do you have? Oh, I don't know. We don't really count. How many does your sanctuary seat? Oh, I don't know. I think it's either 3,000 or 4,000. I'm not really sure. It's 2,200. No, it's 20. I don't know how what is it? About 26,000. I had that. Okay. And I sat there and we were sparring, you know. And I thought, wow, how we have descended into this spirit of competition. I went up there thinking I was a pretty good cheese. Shoot, I'm just a piker compared to those other guys. I heard the other day that Bill Gates walked in a meeting and sat down and that he wasn't there 5 minutes before everybody was complaining about how poor they were. And you couldn't even be invited to the meeting unless you made $100 million a year. So there's always somebody who can do it better, quicker, has more. And if you start living and evaluating yourself by your competition, you're in big trouble. You remember why the first murder occurred in the Bible? Why did Cain kill Abel? Why? Because he started comparing his sacrifice to Abel's sacrifice. And Abel's sacrifice pleased God more than Cain's sacrifice. That was the seed of violence. I listened to George Carlin, this profane prophet I call him, late at night on TV when nobody can know I'm listening to him. But he has this one skit on how people go to war and how wars are extensions of our sexual organs, et cetera, et cetera. And he talks about missiles and bombs. But anyway, I don't recommend it for the children. I really don't recommend it, period. But how many of us feel bad? 30 years ago, I read a Psychology Today study. They studied 370,000 different people. Now, that's a real survey. That's not a 15 people in 1,500 in America. On what made people happy. That was what they wanted to find out. And they said at the beginning, we know that happiness is not related to wealth. It's not related to stealth or health. It's not related to anything that we could find out. In fact, to tell you the truth, we don't know what makes people happy. But we definitely know what makes people unhappy. The number one cause of unhappiness is people comparing themselves to someone whom they think is happy. I am not who I think I am most of the time. I am not who you think I am most of the time. I am whom I think you think I am. That's my story. That was Saul's story. He descended into madness because he started comparing himself to his competitors. And because they were prospering, he thought, for some reason, God had cursed him. How do you get rid of these inner voices? I don't know. I know how to get rid of some of them, and I know how to get rid of those that keep cropping back up. One is prayer, but not just asking God to give me a sense of self-worth. It's, God, let me listen. Let me listen to who you say I am. The greatest challenge is to listen to who God thinks you are. Who does God think you are? Have you ever heard of the cross? We don't preach a lot about the blood and all that at River Bend, but here's the essence of the cross. The cross is God's last and final ultimate statement of who you and I really are. We are someone of such value to God that He sent the best He had to die in our place. And the great news is not if you obey all the rules you'll get to heaven. The great news is that God has got you covered. And it's okay to be who you are because He created you to be who you are. And for you to go against who God created you to be is to go against God Himself. The cross says to me that all of my hopes and dreams that are going this way have been crossed out by sin until Jesus got on the cross. And He turned that cross into something else. Did you hear about the little boy that was failing all of his classes? And his mom and dad put him in Catholic school, and he started doing real well. In fact, his worst grade was math, and he had an A+ after 6 weeks. And they didn't want to spoil it. But they said, Johnny, why have you changed? Even mathematics. He said, well, when I walked in that first day and they had that guy on that plus sign, I knew they meant business. That'll preach, my folks. That will preach. Everything we aspire to is crossed out by our sin. But God put His Son on that cross and turned it into a plus sign. That is the good news of the gospel in Jesus Christ. Don't let Your critics tell you who you are. Don't let your can'ts tell you who you are. Don't let your competitors tell you who you are. Let God tell you who you are. I give you a challenge. When you pray, don't say anything for the next 3 days. Every time you pray, get real still and say, God, tell me how you feel about me. Most people are going to God begging and begging. I do. But if I can be still and listen, that's the best kind of prayer. And you don't only need prayer, you need partners. There's only one way for us really to keep falling into the trap of self-hatred, and that's to be with some people who are on the same path and the same journey. A church like River Bend is a church of grace where we know you as you are and we love you anyway. That's the purpose of the church. It's a place to be where the grace of God changes strangers into partners. Question: who tells you who you are? Go and find out what God has to say about you. Let's pray together. Father, I pray that you would help us to be still and to listen and know what you think of us now and in the next days ahead. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you for joining us for Dr. Mann's teaching series, How to Live a Balanced Life. Please proceed to the reverse side of this tape for Part 6, Living Past the Pain.